So, mit ein bisschen Verspätung darf ich Sie.
All right, we've got a slight delay, but I would still like to welcome you to the Maritime panel, to the Marine panel. General Pleiner, General Miluta, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank you, Wolfgang, first of all, for the invitation to join this conference once again, and for the opportunity to discuss marine questions during this event. I'm also very grateful to be leading the marine panel this year, and that we are in person and don't have to do this virtually. Once again, we are talking about the maritime aspect of the strategy in the sense of a leading discipline in the field of global commons. And for this, we have managed to win over very renowned experts on this topic who are especially dealing with the conflict in Ukraine and the war that Russia is waging against Ukraine. First of all, though, I would like to talk about some of the most important issues for naval warfare over the last few years, and that may have been overlooked by the public. The shock that the unthinkable has happened and the war has returned to Europe with all its force may have led some of the observers to maybe come to wrong conclusions and to maybe miss some aspects that we should be paying attention to. And that also includes the maritime aspects, because I would like to remind you all that Europe, and especially Central European countries, have been completely neglecting the maritime aspects. If we look beyond the borders of Europe, I think it will become clear very soon what I'm actually talking about. Let me remind you of what happened in 2021 and at the beginning of 2022, things that happened and that we haven't really noticed in Austria, but that were very significant to the Pacific sphere. This is not yet an open military confrontation similar to what's happening in Ukraine yet, but it does require to look at the naval and maritime aspects of this conflict. In Ukraine, except for nuclear deterrence, maritime aspects play an important role. China's expansion over the last 20 years, especially when it comes to naval warfare, have had severe implications. China has realized that becoming a global power is something they can only achieve by also dominating the seas. So they have started expanding their spheres of influence. They have become increasingly active in this matter and have tried to solve this with maritime approaches. So what they are trying to do is to limit other countries near them at sea. With their increasing military capacity that require qualified actions at sea, it is no longer sufficient to look at the Chinese activities only in the Pacific Ocean or the South China Sea. The Asia-Pacific sphere is also not enough in order to actually judge what's happening here. We have to look at the entire Pacific sphere and the maritime sphere in this part of the world, especially looking at the two island chains that are sort of acting as barriers to China. We must look beyond these chains of islands and look also to the Indian Ocean, where China is also active. They have expanded their domination there as well, and they are cooperating with additional actors that must also be taken into account. Weak enemies, such as some of the countries across the South China Sea, can be neglected here, but we must focus on India and Pakistan. On a political level, this has made for quite some dynamics. India, US, and Australia have created a security dialogue that was triggered by the Japanese foreign minister. Politically, the Chinese are seeing this group as an anti-China security group, and they are quite concerned about a regional alliance similar to NATO is going to form in the Pacific space. There's also another group forming in this part of the world that might make for connections between China, Pakistan, and Russia. And we mustn't neglect this either. Also, France and its overseas territories mustn't be neglected as stakeholders in this territory. The investment of Chinese companies such as Costco or the China Merchants Group must always be seen in connection with their political aims, because they only partly follow the rules of the market. After all, only some of the ports that they have acquired are actually competitive or are relevant in strategic terms. If, however, you were to view this from a Chinese point of view, you would see that they are used to gain influence. Many of these investments, however, not only affect poor states such as Sri Lanka, who have become financially dependent on China, but also Northern Australian ports such as Darwin and other prominent ports in Europe, such as Antwerp, Piraeus, or Rotterdam. We are witnesses to a race of the global and local powers about securing their sphere of influence on the border between the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. For example, in Papua New Guinea, the island of Manao is the site of a US naval base that is being erected there together with Australia. And in April 2022, China signed a security agreement with the Solomon Islands. China is trying to attempting an appeasement politics and saying that they don't actually pursue any military interests with this agreement. But we've heard similar announcements in the South China Sea that we have no reason to believe. And in this connection, we've also seen that in 2021 there was another surprise that happened. AUKUS.
On 50th September 2021, Washington, London, and Canberra officially announced a new security partnership, and the most important fallout of this was the withdrawal of Australia from the agreement with France regarding the construction of submarines of the attack class, regarding a total value of 35 billion euros. Instead, the Australian naval forces will be given access to nuclear submarine technology in order to be able to replace the Collins submarines. In addition, hypersonic arms and attack options need to be developed together. Due to this AUKUS agreement, the US is showing its firm commitment with its most important allies, in particular vis-à-vis China. Now, the response of China was harsh. They said this military alliance of an Anglo-Saxon clique was in accordance with the way of thinking during the Cold War. This was criticism by the Chinese ambassador to the UN and CTBTO in Vienna. Now, but let me briefly talk about an additional fallback. Now, 003 is here to say. Now, a couple of days ago, specifically on 17th of June 2022, the dry dock was flooded, and now the new carrier is available for operations in the harbor of Shanghai. Only 10 years after the first carrier was put in operations, 003, by the name of Fujian, is being put in operations, and the abilities and capabilities of the Chinese naval forces will be expanded. This carrier with conventional engines can be compared with the US counterparts of the Nimitz class. Fujian, as a novelty, has, similar to the US carriers of the fourth class, has electromagnetic catapults. This means that more starts and landing operations with heavily loaded fighter jets are now a possibility. Now, the balance of power between the US and China is heavily debated. While the disputes in Europe are focused on land, the Indo-Pacific area focuses on the naval, the maritime domain. Now, China has, by means of volume, the strongest naval powers. Today, PLAN has 355 war ships, and for China, sea control in its neighboring waters, as well as the South and Eastern China Sea, as well as the Yellow Sea, is essential. It is similarly important to have proper access to the high seas and international commercial routes. China today is the second largest trade power and is going to surpass the US in the 2030s. For that purpose, they need to assert their global interests. It also has to secure access to the necessary resources and keep the trade routes open. For that purpose, they need to utilize its naval powers. The US and its allies are going to take every action in order to maintain the balance of power. Therefore, the US has close allies as Japan, South Korea, Singapore and Australia, and Diego Garcia is going to become even more important. But also the recent statements by President Joe Biden in regards of the defense of Taiwan should not be underestimated. He was asked by a journalist whether he was willing to get involved militarily to defend Taiwan, and he said, yes, that's the commitment we made. The idea that it can be taken by force is just not appropriate. It will dislocate the entire region and be another action similar to what happened in Ukraine. Now, the response of Chinese leadership was not long in coming. Foreign Minister Wang declared there was no room for any compromise if the core interests of sovereignty and territorial integrity of China were at stake. And we all know how China regards Taiwan. And he continued to say that nobody should underestimate the determination and the willingness and also the powers of the Chinese people. And nobody should be in opposition to the 1.4 billion Chinese. So we have seen what prominent power the naval domain plays in the Indo-Pacific area. But what about the war in Ukraine? According to media reports, we could get the impression that the sea only plays a minor role. So these are statements that one could subscribe to on an operational and tactical level. The Russian naval powers only play a supporting role, and Commander ROTHEHÜSER is going to talk about this in greater detail. However, what we're also seeing is the strategic effects of the war at sea in the Black Sea. This becomes primarily noticeable when it comes to shortages of corn shipments and the global effects as a result of the sanctions imposed. Now, maybe we should also give greater priority to the statements made by political elites, and not just as we tend to do it in the West, as we have become used to peace and regard such conflicts to be far from reality. Now, the relationship between what we're seeing in Ukraine and the announcement of Russia for many years are evident today. Maybe observers have not fully regarded this hybrid conflict, and maybe also in terms of thinking about the option of a war in the first place and to resort to military means. Maybe because this is a typical trait of our post-heroic society. If we have a look at what happened at Crimea, for example, the attacks of Novichok, sabotage, for example, economic threats and forceful actions, maybe we have brushed them off the table for a long time. And today we need to tackle the conferences. And some people are saying that today we're seeing the new commencement of a new Cold War. This will not just be felt in Europe, but subsequently it will show global consequences. The confrontation between authoritarian systems and the democratic system is going to become even more prominent and harsher, not just in Europe. Now, the world, as we know it today, is being marked by basic global changes. We have not even left COVID behind, and we see inflation and global supply chains are under attack. For example, semiconductors, minerals, components required for the supply chain, as well as foods, become scarce. And today, the consequences of climate change become evident. But what is really at risk? Is it energy supply? Is it access to food, energy? What is at stake? Well, we need to become clear about the fact that successful negotiations can only be led if you are in a position of strength. That goes for Europe as well. To assert power by military means is going to become a challenge to European forces. I would just like to point out what Chief of General of the UK said yesterday. And those military powers and armed forces that have said goodbye really during peace support operations and stabilization operations are called upon to come up with a new concept, if you will. It is an undisputed fact that naval forces in this global confrontation will play a significant role. But now let us have a look at the immediate situation in Europe. Now the panelists are going to deal with the results of the war in Ukraine. And I would like to ask them, or rather I would like to ask you to first of all, listen to Commander ROTHEHÜSER to give a first analysis of the deployment of the Russian naval forces in Ukraine. General Major Bengt Andersson is going to follow him, and he is going to talk about the Swedish perspective. And last but not least, Rear Admiral SCHNEIDER is going to talk about the impact on the human perception and also leadership concept of authoritarian regimes when it comes to naval warfare.
Der Herr Fregattenkapitän hat die Reise aus Hamburg angetreten und er ist dort am Lehrstuhl für Seestreitkräfte tätig. Er hat davor eine sehr interessante Karriere 2017 bis 2020.
Commander ROTHEHÜSER started his career at the German Navy. He also taught in the US Naval College and Eckernförde. He was also a commander in Eckernförde. This is why, you know, this beautiful image of a submarine is going to be your backdrop. So the floor is yours, Commander. Now, thank you very much, General HOFBAUER, for the kind introduction. Now, to me, it is a great pleasure to be able to talk to you here, to give this presentation, but this is a bit of a premiere, because usually I'm speaking to naval officers, so this is a bit of a novelty. I'm going to try to limit the number of marine or Anglicisms to the smallest. Now, there's probably no topic that has dominated the headline in recent months as much as Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Now, in this process, the fighting on and over the country has been traced and analyzed almost meticulously. And it was with absolute respect that I can tell the Academy here in Vienna that this has been unprecedented. However, The way as I see it, only tactical remarks really are being given when it comes to the naval power. Does that mean that the Navy plays no or only a subordinate role in warfare? And at first glance, it seems to be the case, yes, that it just plays a minor role. Today, however, I would like to take a look at the events at sea and cast a look at them from the perspective of a Western naval operator. And following this, I will give you an assessment of whether, and if so, what geostrategic changes could arise in the course of the war in Ukraine. Now, in preparing this presentation, I only used open resources and deliberately tried to be as unemotional and objective and neutral as possible, even though this is not always easy. And in the case of expert questions on the Russian armed forces, I've drawn on the expertise of our in-house think tank, the German Institute for Defense Studies. Now, what is the role of the Russian Navy and what has it contributed to the Ukraine war? One question arises, namely, what does the Kremlin actually expect from its navy? Now, the starting point for these elaborations is the published Maritime Doctrine of the Russian Federation from 2015, in which the very extensive and ambitious requirements profile is detailed. Now, in addition to the nuclear second strike capability, which will not be considered in my presentation, these are the implementation and protection of national interests on the global oceans, while strengthening the position among the leading naval powers. Now, the global orientation explicitly includes the Arctic and remote regions of the world's oceans and research activities in the Arctic. Therefore, at least on paper, there is a clear orientation that we see towards the maritime powers US and China, which place very similar demands on the respective navies. And indeed, and times have changed, the first participation in the NATO Operation Active Endeavour in 2006 in the Mediterranean, numerous fleet activities far away from the Russian homeland have been observed. This included, for example, participation in the anti-piracy operation in the Gulf of Aden, the Russian-Indian exercise series Indra, a Russian-Chinese Iranian maneuver in the Gulf of Oman, as well as numerous foreign trips to underpin bilateral cooperation. Now, in this connection, it should be noted that the naval units deployed have become significantly smaller since the end of the 2000s and mostly consisted of only one warship, one tanker, and one tugboat. Thus, the projects primarily served presence and diplomacy at sea and not operational preparation or power protection at sea. Now, consequently, these formations were far from being comparable to the NATO's standing naval forces, which are fully operational combat formations as part of the Very High Readiness Joint Task Force that unquestionably serve to deter the alliance and can be deployed at any time against any threats. Now, also the expansion of the naval base in Tartus, Syria, which had already been maintained since the times of the Cold War, and a new facility in Sudan also need to be classified. At first glance, bases far away from home are reminiscent of those of navies such as the US Navy, which can rely on its aircraft carriers units such as Guam, Bahrain, and many other ports for worldwide operations. Now, according to the ideas of some Russian navalists, such as former commander of Blackfleet, Komodedov, Tartus, and Port Sudan, should indeed become the starting point for future power protection in the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean along Soviet lines. Now, in contrast to the US Navy, however, the Russian fleet has yet to be expanded to include modern blue water ships to do justice to this role. Now, in addition, the Russian fleet in Port Sudan has close contractual limits on its use, which means that the bases therefore primarily play the role of a supply port or even to support allies, such in the case of the civil war in Syria. But where is the focus of the mission of today's Russian Navy? In fact, the activities and operations of the Russian naval fleet with tactical operational significance are essentially focused on marginal seas around Russian mainland, this being the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, as well as the coastal region in the North Sea and the Pacific. In these regions, extensive exercises take place regularly, including the fight for naval supremacy, the support of army operations through the use of missiles from sea to land, so-called strike operations, and the conduct of complex landing operations. The exercise Sapad, most recently carried out in 2021 in NATO's northern flank area, with what it claims to be 200,000 troops, should be cited as an example. Now, this also stands to show the big focus and concentration really on what we refer to as near abroad and corresponds with the narrative of NATO that is being spread in a threatening manner. Let us now have a look at this year's events in the Black Sea. As just explained, it is a core area and also core mission of the Russian Navy, practiced in various maneuvers and already practiced in part during the Georgian War in 2008, the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and during the war in Syria. According to a couple of resources, this also included the support of land operations, for example, naval fire support, and also the attack of targets mentioned before, and also amphibian forces were supported. And also, of course, various warship and landing craft. According to open resources, the Black Sea Fleet has so far operated with at least one Western and one Eastern naval unit, with a total number of up to 40 ships consisting of various warships and landing craft. Now, on the very first day of the war, the Navy made its presence felt by occupying Snake Island. This is a 1 square kilometer Ukrainian island located roughly 20 kilometers off the Ukrainian-Romanian borders in the northwest of the Black Sea. It will only acquire far-reaching military significance when, in addition to radar antennas for reconnaissance, missiles are stationed there against land or sea targets, thus decisively influencing the attainment of naval supremacy in the northern Black Sea. The Russian Navy has succeeded in doing this without much resistance, and the establishment of a powerful air defense has so far prevented all Ukrainian attempts at reconquest. Also, the landing of infantry men at Berdyansk near Mariupol on the coast between Crimea and Russian mainland in the northeast of the Sea of Azov also went largely unopposed the following day and supplemented the land warfare with a naval maritime wing. Only in the course of March, during an attempt to carry out another landing near Odessa, did the Russian Navy have to experience that Ukrainians would not surrender without a fight at sea either. Using land-based artillery, they forced Russians to abort the operation. At this point, the naval command lost control, for the first time, that is, of the sea area off the Ukrainian coast, and from then on had to deviate from the prepared operational plans. The flexible Ukrainian use of long-range missiles and artillery against sea targets subsequently prevented the Russian Navy from using the sea area again and again. This is what we refer to as sea denial or sea denial operations. It is therefore to be expected that further regional strategic objectives, such as the capture of Odessa and the further advance into Transnistria, by the way, as revealed in a TV broadcast by Belarusian President Lukashenko, would now have to be disregarded or adjusted. tactical setbacks of the Navy, thus had serious strategic consequences. Now, in addition to the amphibious landings of troops and material, the Navy also played an important role through targeted fire on land targets. This included direct fire support to land operations, especially in the coastal area around Mariupol on the Sea of Azov, with artillery, that is, and all available short-range weapons. In addition, from the earliest stages of the war, important tactical targets such as logistical nodes or critical infrastructure were fired on from the sea with long-range precision missiles of the type Caliber. The targets also included the few remaining Ukrainian naval units after 2014, so that Ukrainian threat from the sea, with the exception of mines, was eliminated very early on, and basically only aircraft, drones, and land-based Ukrainian missiles of the type Neptune, for example, posed a threat to the Russian fleet. And it was precisely the latter that led to the loss of one or two landing craft and the lead ship of the naval unit, the Moskva, in April and March. Subsequently, all Russian warships were withdrawn from the vicinity of the coast, and according to newspaper reports, they maintain a distance of at least 100 kilometers. Now, for this reason, further support for land operations could thus only be provided with the remaining ranged weapons. In addition, the original close blockade against the most important Ukrainian ports was transformed by the Russian Navy into a kind of distant blockade. On the one hand, this can still block civilian shippings, but only to a very limited extent. Is it an option to prevent tactical boat movements and ship movements in and out of the ports? In this content, it should be noted that the initially purely military tactical seaward closure of the ports through the seizure of at least 25 million tons of grain has taken on a supra-regional political dimension in the course of the previous months. Now, how has it been possible for the powerful Russian naval unit to suffer such losses against such an inferior maritime and naval opponent after its initial successes? This will be analyzed on the basis of the events in March, when at least one landing craft was sunk in the port of Berdyansk and the sinking of the Moskva in April. In both cases, it seems that the ships were not protected at all, or at least not sufficiently, against attacks by missiles. According to Western doctrine, the protection of own forces in all dimensions is one of the central tasks of the naval commander, as well as the joint force commander at the operational level. For example, when a landing force enters support, seaward protection is provided by the Navy itself. Local land-based protection, however, is provided by land forces, and air defense and the early detection of an air threat is provided by the Air Force. This ensures that the threat is detected as early as possible and that a timely and comprehensible response can be made. However, this requires a joint operational understanding, what we refer to as a joint awareness, and rapid cross-force command and communication. In the attack on the landing craft in the port of Berdyansk, as in the case of the sinking of the Moskva, no defense measures were apparent. And this leads to the conclusion that neither there was any sense of threat at all, and those involved were unable to perceive the impending attack, or that communication between the defense forces involved did not work. A look at the Russian leadership at the operational level shows us that there is no distinct common understanding between the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy. Joint operations tend to take place in such a manner that one branch of the armed forces is in the lead and that the others act and support predetermined plans. And there is a Russian world and military dictionary for a situation or military doctrine where this is the case, where one leads and others supports. However, Russian experts could not give me any reference where this has actually worked. In Russia, army generals dominate the command and decision-making process, from the general staff to the United Strategic Commands down to the tactical commanders, presumably with only limited sensitivity to naval security concerns near the coast. Now, with that in mind, let us have a look at how they were able to sink the Moskva. On April the 13th, the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, a Russian Slava-class cruiser, was sunk. Most probably it was hit by at least one Ukrainian Neptune missile, and this subsequently led to the sinking of the ship. These missiles were fired over a distance of about 60 to 100 kilometers. Resources differ on that. At big distance, it was fired from land near Odessa. It is noteworthy in this context that the Moskva was actually a ship specialized in the air defense of naval units, and despite 40 years of service, had been recently modernized. In addition to the symbolic loss for the Black Sea Fleet, after all, it was the most powerful Russian ship in the unit, carrying the name of the Russian capital, the Navy also had to cope with numerous other limitations. Now, the Moskva acted as the lead ship, and within the framework of the tactical freedoms assigned to it, it directed and managed operations at sea. And also, at first, one thought that this was a, let us say, one-time success, but it had far-reaching consequences. And therefore, we need to ask ourselves, why had it not been possible for the Moskva to ward off this attack? Similar to the shelling of the landing craft earlier, there were probably some weak points in the command joint coordination of the various forces, the use of the technical systems, and also the processes for fire and leak defense of a ship. Now, in summary, it can be said that the Navy, especially at in the early stages of the war, in the Sea of Azov and the west of the Crimea, made significant contributions. However, due to the successful sea denial strategy from land, which is to say the extensive denial of sea space off the coast by miles and mobile missiles, the Black Sea Fleet's operations were severely limited as the war progressed. Compensating for the losses within the naval unit with a replacement from the Mediterranean unit or from one of the other fleets was no longer an option due to the closure of the Bosporus, and shows the specific and special challenges that marginal seas pose for naval operations, maritime operations. In that way, the naval base in Syria was also cut off from sea supply from the Black Sea, so that the supply will continue to be affected sooner or later. Now, following this, and now, also that we have made an assessment on the contribution of the Black Sea Fleet, I would like to venture on a small outlook and also the long-term consequences from the naval perspective. Now, what you can see here in blue is the Black Sea coast of Russian mainland. Now, from a purely hypothetical point of view, as of today, if the conquered areas along the Black Sea coast and the Snake Island were to remain under Russia's full or partial control, there would be a significant improvement in the Russia's navy influence. It could most probably exercise increased dominance in the northern Black Sea. That's just the background. From a naval theoretical perspective, two elements are necessary in order to be able to exercise naval dominance. First of all, you need a powerful navy, and second, the availability of a base that can be well protected, reliably used, and in the best possible case, directly connect with the mainland. A land-based defense phalanx would additionally support and facilitate any fleet activities. It is precisely these conditions that the belligerent, the war conquests, incidentally going on since 2008 with the Georgian War and 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, have created. By occupying the entire coast of the Sea of Azov, Ukrainian sea denial capabilities in the northeast of the Black Sea could be severely restricted, and at the same time Crimea could be connected to the mainland with the Sevastopol base. In addition, This coastal control will additionally secure the channel access between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, so that in future ship movements between these two marginal seas can take place without any risk. Now, should the Russian military succeed in making further conquests along the coast west of Crimea, the starting position for future naval operations of the Russian Navy in the Black Sea would improve even further. Now, the Snake Island, for that matter, which has been occupied since the beginning of the war, also makes a considerable contribution to this. As a result, Russia could certainly be more self-confident vis-à-vis NATO and the Black Sea, which is particularly significant for its neighbors, Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey, in terms of security policy. NATO's neighbor, that is. But in the end, it does not change the fact that access to the world's oceans from the Black Sea, and with this, the realization of any global power projections can still only take place through the Bosporus. And this strait are controlled by Turkey, a NATO power. And this year, Turkey proved that it is indeed willing to implement the Montreux Convention consistently in any event of a military conflict. Now, from a supra-regional naval and maritime perspective, the change in the Russian sphere of influence would hardly have changed anything. Now, let me briefly summarize what has been said. Now, the Russian Navy has largely unnoticed by the public in the past 4 months continuously supported Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. The focus was on the coastal region of the Black Sea, along the advance of the land forces, and was supplemented by the targeted use of missiles in the entire territory of Ukraine. Now that the Ukrainian forces have succeeded in denying the naval area of the Ukrainian coast through mine laying and the use of land-based missiles, the role of the Black Sea Fleet has diminished. However, the maintenance of the long-range naval blockade, especially against Odessa, is still producing a super-regional effect on the 4th months of the war. Currently, roughly 25 million tons of corn cannot be exploited, which risks triggering a humanitarian disaster in some poorer regions of the world. Now, due to the complex global trade relations, which are largely conducted by sea, hostilities at sea, and especially naval blockades, at least have many indirect consequences for uninvolved, neutral third countries and must be included in the calculations of military strategists and planners. In a long-term assessment, the geographical conquests within the Black Sea could increase the potential for localized naval domination by Russian Navy in a supra-regional view. However, the status quo on NATO's southern flank has not changed significantly. Now, Russia's observed striving for power particularly reflects the calculations of a primary continental power in which the Navy functions more as a supportive element. Now, for a country with an internalized understanding of a sea power, on the other hand, the free oceans and the use of them have much higher priority, especially if one is surrounded by marginal seas. The best recommendations would be to rely on a general recognition and enforcement of a norm-based system, such as the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, instead of regional maritime domination. And for this too, efficient naval forces are indispensable, because after all, securing the conventions worldwide should not be taken for granted. Thank you very, very much, and I'm very much looking forward to taking any questions you might have afterwards.
So, Herr Kapitän, herzlichen Dank.
Captain, thank you so much.
Pass the floor to Major General Bengt Andersson. A very warm welcome here to Vienna. I'm glad to have you here, and I may introduce the General just briefly. After graduating from the Swedish Naval Academy, he was part of the anti-ship artillery, and from there his career brought him to the amphibious part of the Swedish Armed Forces, and he was second in command of the Amphibious Training Battalion and then the commanding officer of the Marine Battalion. From there he went to the United States to see what the Marine Corps had to offer for the Swedish perspective, and he graduated there with as a distinguished participant. And he became commander of the 1st Amphibious Regiment and the Swedish Marine Brigade later on. And from 2003 to 2006, he was the commander of the Maritime Component Command of the Swedish Armed Forces. Later on, he commanded the Nordic Battle Group in 2008 and again in 2015. General, I'm glad to have you here and looking forward to your impressions from the Swedish perspective on what we are seeing in the east of Europe.
Thank you, General HOFBAUER. First of all, excuse me, my German is too rusty, so I have to speak English. Generals and admirals, ladies and gentlemen, I am really honored to once again having been invited to speak here at this highly considered conference. It's also especially interesting for a Swede because we don't discuss strategy in Sweden, or very seldom. Sometimes in the military academy you do it, but that's when you leave the academy you don't talk about it again. So I will start with the question, is there a Swedish national security strategy? I would hope that the answer is yes, but it could be no. But the most correct answer would be maybe. And the Swedish Armed Forces headquarters has the strategic level and the operational level. But I have, once a year, there is a command post exercise in the Swedish Armed Forces headquarters. I have been the exercise director for that exercise since 2009, except for 2017. And I will be the exercise director this autumn. For the first time ever, during the exercise 2021, last year, the strategic level was represented. And this year, the main focus will be on the operational level and the tactical level. The strategic level will not be represented. Sweden has not formally been to war since 1814, and that was against our neighbor Norway. Our last war against Russia was 1809, and that was when Sweden lost Finland to Russia. And I should just take 1 second or 10 seconds to explain the relation between Finland and Sweden, because Sweden has been a country that has been to war many times. I come back to that later. But Sweden has never invaded Finland. Finland and Sweden was one country. Sweden has invaded Norway and Denmark and all those countries, and they have been having those as a part of the country. But Sweden and Finland was one country. Just to mention that. Before Sweden lost Finland, we had fought many wars. It is, for example, said that Sweden and Denmark have been to war against each other for more than 30 times. 11 of those after Sweden became a nation, 1523. Next year is 500 years as a nation. But as I said, Sweden has not formally taken part in a war since 1814. When Sweden got a new king, 1880, a long but not unbroken tradition of neutrality started. During and after the Second World War, neutrality and freedom of alliance became a central part of the Swedish national strategy. In order to be able to stay neutral, Sweden decided that the armed forces should be strong and that Sweden should have a national defense industry. The result was, among other factors, that Sweden, with a population of 8.5 million in 1990, could mobilize more than 800,000 soldiers and had more than 500 jet fighters, for example, made in Sweden. After the fall of the wall, 1989, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, 1991, Swedish politicians stated there was no longer any military threat against Sweden, and a national military force was not longer necessary. The armed forces were tasked to focus on international missions. It was said that Sweden is best defended, quote, is best defended in Afghanistan, unquote. The conscription system was abandoned or laid dormant, and the size of the armed forces shrank from more than 800,000 to less than 20,000. I say again, from more than 800,000 soldiers and sailors and airmen to less than 20,000. But this is important to have in mind. The policy of neutrality was still valid and emphasized by the Swedish politicians. And it's also important to remember that NATO membership was not an issue in Sweden. It was not discussed. Nobody cared. There were only two parties on the conservative and liberal side who were pro-NATO. When Russia unlawfully invaded and annexed the Crimean Peninsula in 2014, this came as a shock for the Swedish politicians and to a certain extent to the common man. One realized suddenly that Russia had been increasing defense spending during the last years. One realized also that Russia did not hesitate to attack a peaceful neighbor, and one realized that Sweden did not have armed forces able to defend Sweden. Already a couple of years earlier, 2012, the Swedish Supreme Commander, General Sverker Göransson, stated that the Swedish armed forces could last, at most, 1 week and only operate in one area of Sweden. But this statement did not result in anything more than a discussion if the Supreme Commander had revealed top-secret information. And that is very interesting. The invasion of Crimea gave a completely Ukraine gave a completely different result. The parliament decided to gave a completely different result. The parliament decided to increase the defense spendings and that the armed forces should change focus from international missions to defend Sweden. However, the increase was rather modest. Sweden should still rest on neutrality, but now added with cooperation with the Nordic countries, especially Finland, European Union and NATO, but only cooperation, no membership. One important signal to Russia was a remilitarization of the island of Gotland in the middle of the Baltic Sea, who had been without military representation for many years. It's not really true because there was home guard, but that is only home guard. At this time, the NATO issue was still not very hot, even though more people started to discuss NATO. The Swedish government argued that we, Sweden, had so good connections with NATO that NATO would come to rescue if Sweden was attacked. The opposition, on the other hand, argued that without the membership, there wouldn't be any help. Now the NATO question has reached the Swedish general public, but at this time most Swedes, more than 60%, was clearly against the membership. In the Swedish parliament, more parties, almost 50%, was pro-NATO membership. And suddenly, February 24, the Swedish politicians was shocked again. But the days after were even more shocking. Ukraine, that just like Sweden was a partner nation to NATO, did not get any substantial help from NATO. Almost every politician, except for the Minister for Defense and the Minister for Interior, realized that if Russia attacked Sweden or Finland, no help was coming from NATO. There was also a major change in the Swedish opinion. Now more than 60% was pro-NATO membership. 20 to 30% do not have an opinion, and less than 20% are against the membership. This is some sort of revolution in Swedish thinking, I must say. A couple of weeks later, in the middle of May, Sweden and Finland applied for membership in NATO. Even the two ministers earlier mentioned changed their minds, and the Minister for Defense stated that NATO membership was the best thing to happen for Swedish security and the stability in the region. We can now see that Vladimir Putin made an astonishing miscalculation. He had earlier, in the end of 2021, and beginning of 2022 threatened Finland and Sweden if our nations should apply for NATO membership. And one of the results of his invasion of Ukraine is that Sweden and Finland have applied for membership. So what are the conclusions from this? Well, I think there are many conclusions to be drawn, of course, but I will only mention two. One result of the Russian war against Ukraine is that Sweden and Finland is completely changing the national security strategy. From an almost rabid neutrality policy, where Sweden, at least formally or with lip service, claimed that Sweden should be impartial in case of war between neighboring countries, to a strategy where Sweden accepts the implication of Article 5 in the NATO treaty. Another result is that the strategic situation in the Baltic Sea and the Baltic area have changed completely. If Finland and Sweden are approved as members in NATO, as you can see on the right side of the slide, the Baltic Sea is almost an inland NATO area. We have St. Petersburg in the east part of the Gulf of Finland, and Kaliningrad, which is the home of Immanuel Kant, earlier mentioned today, in south of Lithuania, with the only connection to Russia with the Souvlaki corridor. And this is really a major change. I do not believe that it was Mr. Putin expected when he invaded Ukraine. Just to round off, I have been speaking about how the Russian invasion of Ukraine could completely change the Swedish thinking about the long tradition of neutrality. Sweden was, as mentioned, neutral between 1880 and 2022. That is 204 years. Putin changed that, not only for the Swedish political level, but also for the Swedish people. I have also been talking about how the strategic situation in the Baltics will change if Sweden and Finland are accepted as NATO members. The two non-aligned countries, Sweden and Finland, will be two countries considered or looked upon as enemies from the Russian side. You can see it clearly on the slide. So the strategy has changed. The vision to keep Sweden out of war is the same, but the strategy is completely different. Thank you.
Karsten Schneider. Rednerport zu treten, er ist 1974 in die Bundeswehr eingetreten, Teil der Crew 774. Nach dem Studium wurde er dann Kommandant eines Schnellbootes, somit ein Schnellbootfahrer. Aber nach der Admiralstabsausbildung 1991 hat er dann 1995 auch das Kommando über die Fregatte Lübeck im Hintergrund bekommen. Dann verschiedene Verwendungen in der Bundesministerium für Verteidigung übernommen, war auch tätig in der sogenannten Weizsäcker-Kommission. 2002 Kommandeur Fregattengeschwader, bis 2003 auch Kommandeur des deutsch-französischen Marineverbandes, verschiedene Funktionen im ENG wiederum. Dann stellvertretender Kommandeur und Direktor Lehrgänge an der Führungsakademie, wo wir ja schon sehr enge deutsch-österreichische Kontakte geschmiedet haben. Und zuletzt Chef des Stabes am Marinekommando in Rostock seit 2020 im Ruhestand und seit Juni 2021 Präsident des Deutschen Maritimen Institutes. Herr Konteradmiral, danke, dass Sie sich zu unserem Panel gesellt haben und ich darf Ihnen das Wort übergeben.
Meine lieber hochverehrter Herr General Hofbauer,
General Hofbauer,
es ist für mich einfach eine große Ehre.
I am very honored to be here today and to join such a renowned event. Over the last few years, it has gained quite the reputation.
Das ist für mich quasi ein Auftrag, dem ich mich
To me, this is a claim that I am following, a call that I am following. This is a wonderful forum, a wonderful audience to whom I may speak here.
Okay.
I would also like to welcome you all here, and I think we can all agree that when we say that the current most urgent challenge cannot be met with a more suitable topic than the one of this event, the interface of strategic purpose and operational implementation. So how could it have happened that after this strategic preparation that was very thorough turned out to be such an operative and tactical failure? I have chosen the somewhat unwieldy title, The Einfluss of the Image of Humans and the Understanding of Leadership of Authoritarian Regimes on Naval Warfare, because I believe that the image of humans and the understanding of leadership that is derived from it are almost of exemplary importance for the course of this war. There's still no completed evaluation of this war, but there are some initial ideas about what lessons could be learned from the past months. So my aim is not to close this discussion or to conclude this discussion, but to actually stimulate it with my lecture. And allow me here to also point to what the other speakers have said, because this might add to the understanding of what we're going to talk about here. So how did the war come about? Well, the Russian attack on Ukraine on 24 February 2022 probably took almost everyone in the world by surprise. Some couldn't imagine a war in Europe. Others, among whom I count myself, didn't believe that a seemingly calculating man, very soberly calculating man like Putin would do something that would cause such serious damage to his country. This surprise was soon followed by a second one. The Russian army wasn't able to defeat the Ukrainian army, but they actually failed in several attempts. And it is worth considering these two surprises in context. The first question is the following. Why did the Russian action took Western societies by surprise? After all, there were many statements by Putin, not least at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, that indicated his confrontation with the West. The military operations against Georgia in 2008 and against Ukraine in 2014 with the annexation of the Crimea opened the eyes of anyone who was willing to see, but many did not want to see and did not want to see these signs. Underlying this, I think, is a masterpiece of strategic communication. It can be described as a combination of lulling to sleep and threat. In many Western societies, not least in Germany, the Russians were successful in building up a very Russia-friendly mood. And at the same time, Russia cultivated its image as a very resolute and very powerful military that should not be messed with. So whenever people in the West were startled by Russian activities, many were ready to, lie down again quickly and close their eyes. The threat that they saw was too horrible for them to actually be prepared to deal with the necessary consequences. So Russia wasn't only able to change the borders in Europe in terms of military power, but also they were able to enforce its interest in Syria and Libya with physical force. And the prerequisite for this successful strategy is central control. A very small leadership circle in the Kremlin pulls all the strings. Foreign policy is controlled from there, as is the Russian media. They are planning subversive activities, from the acquisition of renowned sympathizers to the murder of opponents. And the Kremlin makes sure that Germany's gas tanks are empty at the decisive moment when its own army marches the Ukrainian border. So this is state action of a kind that is hardly imaginable in Western democracies. Everything worked perfectly until February 24th in 2022, the day on which Putin made one crucial mistake and overstepped his mark. The strategic masterstrokes were followed by operational and tactical disaster. Instead of taking Kiev in a few days, as expected, the long-planned offensive was shattered time and again by the stubborn and skillful Ukrainian defenses. Since then, things have been going pear-shaped for Russia on the battlefield and even more in international politics. Or at least very much not as planned. So how could such widely divergent results come about? Is it an inexplicable event, or is there a system behind it? Well, one thing is clear. The Russian leadership, for all its skill in strategic communication, has made a number of major mistakes in military strategy, and those mistakes have contributed significantly to the current situation. And allow me to provide another factor, that is the image of humans underlying the Russian understanding of leadership and the resulting centralism as a common cause of success and failure. Putin's position of power is based on having created a system of checks and balances in his close environment. And in this system, there are various circles of power, Siloviki and oligarchs, and they watch each other, they spy on each other, and they put each other down. The president has his eye on everything and leads with the old principles of power, like the Latin divide et impera, divide and conquer, or Lenin's trust is good, control is better. What works in the Moscow headquarters, however, cannot be transferred to the vastness of Russia. People have always known that God is up in heaven and the Tsar is far away. Here, divide and conquer means that you have to strictly separate the different power apparatuses. They must never be given the chance to ally against each other. This is true even within the armed forces, where close stovepiping is the order of the day. The principle of authoritarian leadership, which is consciously cultivated in the Russian armed forces, is based on a view of human nature based on mistrust, in which the subordinate forces are first and foremost a problem of control and only then a potential problem for performance. This is diametrically opposed to the principle of leadership with a mission that we practice in the West, in which people's potentials are in the foreground. They have to be activated in an appropriate way for the task at hand. Decisions are entrusted to the lowest competent level in order to bring the entire expertise available in the troops to bear. If one understands the mind controlled by our conscience as the greatest human ability, then it becomes very clear which of the two systems is the more efficient. The mistrust among the Russian army led to a culture of communication in which the troops did not know what was really planned when they attacked Ukraine. We've all read the report about this. So they weren't able to prepare mentally or materially. Neighboring commands proceeded without coordination. Initially, there was no overall operational command. Direct requests for air support from the battalion combat groups to the Air Force were not structurally planned. So what was lacking was what we call horizontal self-synchronization between the forces involved. because it contradicted the intended stovepiping that the Russian army pursues.
Schauen wir mal auf den Seekrieg.
So let's take a look at the naval war. As we have heard,
Nur vordergründig
the war in Ukraine is only superficially primarily a land war with very few spectacular actions at sea, as we've already heard during this panel.
weniger ins Auge fallend, aber immer spürbar.
So it's less eye-catching, but increasingly noticeable that the Russians are blocking Ukrainian exports. The strategic approach was to cut Ukraine off from access to the Black Sea as quickly as possible in order to stop their exports. The aim here was not only to damage Ukraine, but to create a situation of shortage on the world markets, and unfortunately also on the village markets of poor regions in the world, and to force good conduct up to and including the lifting of sanctions. And besides, good money can be made with stolen Ukrainian grain when world market prices go up. So this strategic approach is actually well thought out and was relatively successful. However, it has reached its limits in practical implementation, as we have also seen in land warfare with the mines. Although Russia succeeded in occupying the strategically important Snake Island, further landing operations, as we heard, along the Ukrainian coast all failed. Some of the landing ships were lost, not all of them, but many were damaged. The loss of the Moskva and its air surveillance capability severely limits Russian freedom of movement, as does the knowledge of the new Ukrainian sea target missiles that were fired on the Moskva. In order to understand the effects of the Russian understanding of command and control on the strategic operational possibilities of the Navy, we need a short excursion to the tactical level and into the internal structures of warships. On the ships of the People's Navy, we noticed in 1990 that following the Soviet model, they had a main command post, the HBS, instead of an operations center. The orders are received there and distributed by the commander to various subordinate command posts or cabinets. On larger ships, such as the Moskva, there are cabinets for missiles, for artillery, for anti-aircraft, for submarine hunting, etc. This means that stovepiping continues all the way down to the shipboard organization. For comparison, in a modern Western operational command unit, all these workplaces are found in one room. They are connected to each other via an integrated command and weapon deployment system. In a collaborative process and in horizontal synchronization, a situational picture is created on the basis of which the commander makes his decisions. This organization can also react and can react just as well as it can act. In the Russian model, however, the information domains remain separate, and the commander essentially carries out the orders he or she receives from external agencies. They do not have an overview of the situation with all the information available on board, based on which they could lead and decide situationally. There is no provision for subordinate superiors to make decisions on their own responsibility. In order to keep the range of action in their own hands, authoritarian armed forces often run their operations according to a very carefully prepared script, if you will. This results in a tendency to go on the offensive, because on the defensive, the law of the game lies with the enemy. Now, it is by no means the case that the Russian naval forces are useless or even harmless to an enemy. If they are deployed in a carefully planned manner and under close command, and if they benefit from the moment of surprise, they are very much capable of striking quite fierce blows. Promising possibilities for deployment include support of land forces, defense of bastions, This is where the
Weitreichende
nuclear potential of the Russian
Flugkörperangriffe,
army is,
vor allem
but
auf
also
Trägergruppen,
long-range
einstmals
missile
von
attacks,
Hauptaufgabe
especially on
Moskwa,
carrier groups, which was
amerikanische
once the
Trägergruppen
task
mit den
of the
weitreichenden
Moskwa,
Flugkörpern anzugreifen. Und
and
Landzielbekämpfung
also
als Teil
land
der
target
konventionellen
engagement as
Abschreckung.
part of the conventional deterrence strategy.
Letztgenannte Aufgabe
The latter task
ist ein gutes
is a good
Beispiel
example of the niche
Beispiel für die
role
Nischenrolle, die die russische Marine letztendlich spielt.
ultimately played by the Russian Navy.
Als Folge des Verlusts der
As a
ukrainischen
result of
Werft
the loss of Ukrainian
Ende der
shipyards
Sowjetunion
at the end of the Soviet
ist die
Union,
Kapazität Russlands zum
Russia's capacity
Marineschiffbau
to
stark
build naval
eingeschränkt.
vessels has been
Das
severely
zeigte sich unter
limited.
anderem bei dem Versuch, in
This was
Frankreich
evident,
große
among other
Landungsschiffe in
things,
Form
in the
zweier
attempt to
Hubschrauberträger zu
acquire
bauen.
large cargo ships in France in the form of
kann
two
man nicht mehr selber
helicopter
bauen.
carriers because they can't build them themselves anymore.
Seit den 1990er Jahren konnte
Ever
Russland
since the
faktisch nur
1990s,
noch
Russia has
kleinere
in
Schiffe
fact only been
von
able
Korvetten,
to build
vielleicht
smaller
Fregattengröße
ships,
bauen
such as
und von denen man einige
corvette-sized ships,
größere und kleinere
of
Serien
which it
auflegt.
launched several series.
Bereits bei den Fregatten der
But
Admiral
the
Grigorowitsch-Klasse
Admiral
stieß man an seine Grenzen,
Grigorowitsch-class
als die
frigates already
Ukraine
reached their
nach
limits when
2014
Ukraine
keine
stopped
Turbinen
supplying
und Deutschland keine
turbines
Motoren mehr
and
lieferte.
Germany stopped supplying engines.
Diese Korvetten,
These corvettes,
insgesamt nicht nur die, wurden
and not just
wurden mit
these
einer
corvettes, were
Zahl weitreichender
equipped with a
Flugkörper
large
des Typs
number
Kaliber
of
bestückt,
long-range missiles,
mit denen man Land-
including
und
the
Seeziele auf
Caliber-type
große Entfernung
missiles,
angreifen kann.
with which land and sea
Diese in
targets could be
Fachkreisen als
attacked at long
Kalibrisierung
range.
der russischen Marine
This
bezeichnete
development,
Entwicklung
long known among
entspricht der
experts as
Doktrin,
the
unter der Kontrolle eines zentralen
calibrization of the
Hauptquartiers
Russian
einen Schlag
army,
offensiv durchzuführen.
is in line with the doctrine of
Damit nutzt
conducting a
man
strike
eine seit
offensively
langer
under the
Zeit
control
bestehende,
of a central
insbesondere schon
headquarters.
sowjetische und
This
später
makes use
russische
of a
Stärke,
long-standing special
nämlich
Soviet
leistungsfähige
and then
Flugkörper.
later Russian strength, namely
Mit
powerful
zum Teil sehr
missiles,
großer Reichweite
some with
und
very
gleicht
long
damit andere
ranges,
Schwächen aus.
and compensates for other weaknesses.
Dann kommen noch dazu Friedens- und Krisenaufgaben.
In
Die
addition, there are
Landungsschiffe machen
peacekeeping
wichtige
and
logistische
crisis
Aufgaben
tasks. For
in
example, the
Syrien
landing
und
ships fulfill
Libyen.
important logistical support tasks
Eine
in the
weitere
operations in
Aufgabe
Libya and
ist
Syria.
Machtdemonstrationen in
Another task
außerheimischen
of these
Gewässern.
ships is the demonstration of power in
Eindrucksvolle
non-domestic
Schiffe
waters. They are
Die
impressive
Slava-Klasse
ships, like
verfehlen
the
in
Slava-class
vielen Gegenden der
cruisers
Welt
do not
nicht ihren
fail to make
Eindruck.
an impression in many parts of the
Ob
world.
allerdings Verbände aus
However,
einem
one may
und somit
doubt
immer
whether
älteren
formations
Kriegsschiff
consisting
begleitet
of a
durch
larger
einen
and
Schlepper,
always
vorsichtshalber,
older warship
und einen
Tanker
Tanker
accompanied by
auf
a
Dauer diese
tugboat
Wirkung
and a
erzielen
tanker
können,
can achieve
darf man
this
bezweifeln.
effect in the long run.
Man denke an die Bilder des rauchenden
May think of the
Flugzeugträgers
pictures of the
Kuznetsov,
smoking aircraft carrier
der inzwischen seit
Kuznetsov,
Jahren in der Werft liegt und nicht
which
wieder anfängt.
has been lying in the shipyard for years now and isn't going
Was
back
hingegen
into service anytime
Nicht
soon.
funktioniert,
What
schnelle
doesn't work
Reaktion
well,
und selbstständige
on
Entscheidungen
the other
vor Ort.
hand, is anything that requires
Zum
quick
Beispiel
reaction and
freilaufende,
independent decisions
ungeplante
on the
Gefechte
spot. For example,
mit
freewheeling
organisierten
unplanned
Gegnerkräften.
engagements with organized enemy forces.
Amphibische
But
Operationen,
also amphibious
die über lokale
operations
Unterstützung
that
des Heeres
go
hinausgehen.
beyond local army support.
Komplexe Operationen
Complex
insgesamt,
operations as a
zum
whole,
Beispiel
for example,
operativer Flugbetrieb.
operational air
Darüber kann ich
operational
gerne hinterher
air
was
support.
sagen, aber das
And we'll
ist,
talk about this later on,
wird nicht so richtig
maybe.
was.
But
Seekrieg ist
they
per
don't
se
seem to be succeeding in this.
dynamisch und komplex.
Naval
Er
warfare
erfordert
is very
lagegerechte,
dynamic
schnelle und
and
flexible
complex. It
Entscheidungen.
requires quick and flexible
Situationsgerechtes
decision-making in
Verhalten
line with the situation.
ohne Anweisungen von oben
Without
sind dem
instructions from
russischen
above.
Führungsverständnis jedoch
However,
fremd.
that is alien to the Russian
Das
understanding of
daraus
leadership.
resultierende
The
Bestreben,
resulting
freilaufende Gefechte mit
endeavor
materiell
to
ebenbürtigen Gegnern
avoid
zu
these
vermeiden,
free-ranging engagements with
begrenzt die
materially equal
Möglichkeiten der
opponents
Seestreitkräfte
very much
erheblich.
limits the possibilities
In
of
klassischen
naval
Seemachtkategorien
forces.
ausgedrückt, und man hörte sie schon,
Expressed in very
reicht das
classical
russische
naval
System
power
gegenüber einem
categories, the Russian
organisierten
system is
Gegner
sufficient for
für
sea
Sea Denial,
denial
also die Verwehrung eines Gebiets, aber nie
against
für
an
Sea Control,
organized
nämlich den Gegner
opponent, but
daraus.
they will never be able to achieve
Also
sea
ein
control.
Gebiet für sich zu nehmen, wo der Gegner nicht mehr will. Vor diesem Hintergrund würde ich einen Blick nach China werfen wollen. Die Frage ist nämlich, was ziehen die da
Let's
für
take a look
Schlüsse
at
Richtung
China
Taiwan?
now and what they are planning
Man darf
towards
davon
Taiwan.
ausgehen, dass China
It can be
nach
assumed
sich
that
hinsichtlich der
China is
konventionellen
strongly
Kriegführung,
oriented towards
Seekriegführung,
Russia in terms of
sich
conventional
stark an Russland
warfare,
orientiert, schon allein wegen
if only
fehlender
because of a
eigener
lack
Erfahrung.
of experience of its own.
Sollte China den
China
Russland-Ukraine-Krieg ehrlich
honestly
auswerten,
evaluate the
wird es feststellen, dass viele der
Russia-Ukraine
russischen
war and to
Schwächen
be
in den
honest
eigenen
about it, it will
Streitkräften
find
ebenso
many of the
vorhanden
Russian
Das gilt unter
weaknesses
anderem für die
are also
Führung, die
present in
Logistik
its
und die
own armed
Synchronisation der
forces.
Kräfte.
And this applies to leadership, logistics and
Russland ist es
synchronization of
nicht gelungen,
forces.
einen
Russia hasn't
Angriff
been
über
able
ungesicherte
to
Landgrenzen
successfully complete an
gegen einen
attack
zahlenmäßig
across
und
unsecured
materiell
land
viel
borders
schwächeren
against a
Gegner
much weaker
erfolgreich
opponent
abzuschließen.
in terms of numbers and material.
Wenn China Taiwan
Quite the
besetzen will,
contrary. And if
muss es hingegen
China
über
were to
100 Seemeilen
occupy
offenes Wasser
Taiwan,
angreifen.
it will have to attack
Und die
over
Verteidigung
100
der
nautical
Küsten
miles of
Taiwans ist
open
viel
waters,
einfacher
and defending
als die der
Taiwan's
offenen
coastline is
ukrainischen Grenzen.
much easier than defending Ukraine's open borders.
Eine amphibische Landung gilt
An amphibious landing is
als eine
considered
der
one of the most
komplexesten militärischen
complex military
Operationen
operations
überhaupt.
ever.
Sie erfordert genau all
Requires
das an Führung,
precisely the kind of
was die
leadership
russischen Streitkräfte in
that
der
Russian
Ukraine haben
forces
vermissen lassen,
have lacked in Ukraine,
was mit der chinesischen
which is probably
Führungsphilosophie
even harder to
vermutlich
reconcile
noch
with
schwerer zu
Chinese
vereinbaren sein wird.
leadership philosophies.
Wie schwer sich die chinesische Marine mit dem Einsatz ihrer
Just
Kräfte
how
tut,
difficult the
habe ich
Chinese
vor einigen
Navy
Jahren beim
finds it
Besuch
to
eines
deploy its
Schiffsverbands in Hamburg
forces
erlebt.
was demonstrated a few years ago when I
Dieser
visited a
Verband
ship
war
group in
ein paar Wochen,
Hamburg
Monate
that
am
had
Horn von
previously
Afrika
spent
angeblich in
several
einem
weeks on
Antipiraterieeinsatz
apparently
gewesen.
an
Das heißt, er war da,
anti-piracy
man hat ihn
operation
beobachtet.
at the Horn of Africa.
Und wir waren auf das Landungsschiff eingeladen.
And
das
we were
waren zwei
invited to
Bordhubschrauber,
visit this
Transporthubschrauber
landing vessel
verfügte.
and had two shipboard
Und ich ging in
helicopters.
den Hangar
And
und
I
eines war
went into
völlig
the
klar.
hangar, and one
Dieses Schiff
thing was
hatte
clear.
monatelang
This
keinerlei
ship
operativen
had
Flugbetrieb
not had
Also
any
ich habe
tactical
genügend
flight
Hubschraubertragende
operations
Schiffe
in
geführt
months.
und gesehen
I
und
have
mitgemacht.
led enough
Aber
helicopter
nichts
carriers in my
Das Einzige, was
time,
gut zu
and
sehen
there
war,
were
auf dem
no
Fußboden,
traces of any operations
überall da,
having
wo die
happened.
Räder
The
des
only thing
Hubschraubers
that I
gestanden hatten,
did
schwarze
see
Flecken, wo über Monate so leicht
was
auf dem
that there were
Raumuntergrund
black
geschummert.
traces on the ground where the helicopters had been sitting for so many months.
Liegt wieder daran, dass man da zu viel eigene Entscheidungen treffen muss.
So this has not been operational
Also man
because
sagt schon, die machen auch
the
manchmal
team on ship wouldn't have been
Hubschrauberbetrieb, aber
able
offensichtlich war
to
das so ein
make their own
abgesetzter Verband,
decisions.
also,
So basically, they seem to have been their own team, and the general command didn't have enough confidence in their
Das ist nämlich eine
actions
Angelegenheit,
and in their
da muss
decision-making
viel und
skills.
ohne viele Rückfragen
So-
auf niedriger, auf höherer Ebene und so weiter entschieden.
These operations
Und diese Entscheidung,
require decision-making
wenn da so ein
that is very
Hubschrauber
short
wackeln ein Schiff
notice.
rummacht,
And if
haben
you have
Fehler
one of
passiert.
these
Da
shipboard
kann was
helicopters, they are cause for many mistakes.
Vor allem,
Many
wenn
things
das
can go
System nicht
wrong
geübt ist.
here,
Und das ist
especially
bei-
if these
vor diesem
systems and if
Hintergrund
these
erscheint es
procedures
äußerst
haven't been
fraglich,
practiced.
ob man aus
So
den
it
jetzt
is
in großen
highly
Stückzahlen zulaufenden
questionable
Material
if,
nutzvolle
you know,
Leistung
because of
rausholen können.
the many materials that are now
Zweifel.
coming in, that
Ich sag
the
mal,
Russian army can actually
vor
handle them,
003
or
habe
that the
ich jetzt
Chinese
nicht
army can
vor diesem
actually handle
Hintergrund
them.
ganz so viel.
Against this backdrop, there's really not very much that we can
Manches
expect
für
here.
diese Fragestellung könnte man schon bei
Some
genauer
of the
Auswertung
things
des
that are
Russland-Ukraine-Krieges
valuable
lernen.
here when we look at
Frage ist
China,
nur,
some things can also be learned for the
Peking
war in
die
Ukraine.
sicherlich vorhandenen Pläne noch
There
mal
are
einer
plans that
genauen
exist,
Überprüfung
but they
unterziehen
must
möchte.
be re-evaluated. And if one were to do
Denn
that,
die Folgen der
then
autoritären
the
Führungskultur
consequences
nach unten
of
schlagen
this
auf die oberen
authoritarian
Ebenen zurück,
leadership culture
wie die
will always
strategische
have an
Fehleinschätzung des
effect
Kremls
both
zeigt.
upwards and downwards, as was evident
Viele der Annahmen
with what the
bezüglich
Kremlin
der
was
Ukraine,
doing. Many of the assumptions that
politischen
were
Verhaltens,
made about Ukraine, its
Streitkräfte
political
und des
behavior, its armed
Durchhaltewillens der
forces,
Bevölkerung
and the population's will to
beruhten auf
persevere
ideologisch
were,
eingefärbtem
were
Mundschenk.
based on
Kritik
ideological
daran und
wishful
gegenteilige
thinking.
Einschätzungen,
Criticism
die
of
sind
this
offensichtlich
and
bei der
contrary
obersten russischen
assessments
Führung
obviously
nicht auf offene
did
Ohren.
not fall on
Das
open ears
alles
at the Russian
spricht
leadership
dagegen,
level.
dass das politische System in China
Everything
eher
here
als in Russland
suggests
bereit
that
ist,
the political system in
der obersten
China
Führung
is more
unerwünschte
willing
Wahrheiten
than
zu
in Russia to deliver unwanted truth to the top leadership.
Sofern also Präsident Xi Jinping
So unless President
sich
Xi
aus Zweifeln
Jinping
an bisherigen
starts having
Plänen kommt,
doubts on his own about the plan so far,
besteht durchaus in meinen Augen die reale
there
Gefahr,
is, I think,
dass
a
er in eine
real
ähnliche Falle
danger
läuft wie
that he
Putin.
will walk into a similar
Aber wir
trap
hoffen
as
trotzdem,
Putin.
dass sein Appetit
Nevertheless,
dessen
let us
bremst
hope
ist.
that his appetite has been
Ja, dann kann man noch sich noch
spoiled
eine-
by what
abschließend
he's
eine
seen
Frage
in
stellen.
Ukraine in recent months.
Sind die Russen,
And
sind
these
die Chinesen
observations
überhaupt
lead
in der
to the
Lage,
question
innerhalb
of
ihres
whether a
Systems
system like the
Fehler
Russian or the
auszumerzen?
Chinese can reform itself.
So, ich sage mal aus meiner Sicht
In
gibt
my
es
opinion,
unüberwindbare
there
Hindernisse.
are two
bestehende
insurmountable
Material
obstacles to this. The existing
Ist auf die
material
traditionellen Führungsvorstellungen zugeschnitten. Ich sage
tailored
mal,
to the
Hauptbewirtschaftung.
traditional ideas of command and control.
Die Systemintegration von
System integration
Sensoren
of
und Waffen
sensors and
fehlt
weapons is
und ist nicht
lacking
nachrüstbar.
and can also not be retrofitted.
Kriegsschiffe sind in Hardware
Warships
gegossenes
are
Menschenbild.
basically human images cast in hardware.
Ein geändertes Führungsverständnis
Understanding
erfordert
of
letztlich eine andere
leadership
Flotte, eine neue
basically
Flotte.
requires a new fleet.
Noch schwieriger wird es auf der Seite der
What's even
Ausbildung.
more difficult is the training side.
Wenn man Offiziere der unteren
If
Führungsebene,
officers at the
nämlich
lower levels of command,
Bootskommandanten oder
from the
Kommandeur kleiner
boat
Verbände,
commander
also
or
sozusagen
commanders of
Kompanie- und
small
Bataillonschiff-Ebene,
units, small companions, companies, for
dazu
example,
erzwöge,
were educated and
selbstständig
trained in the sense of independent
würden Sie
decision
das ja als
making,
Admiral auch noch tun wollen.
then they would still want to do
dann wird's
that
gefährlich.
once they've become
Das wird zur
admirals,
Gefahr für
and
das
that's
System.
where
Und
there
deshalb
would
glaube
be a
ich nicht,
danger
dass Sie
to the
dazu
system. So
das
in
hinkriegen.
this respect, I cannot imagine any remedy within the
Ich möchte mit einem
system.
Beispiel abschließen, das
Let me
heute Morgen auf
conclude
Focus Online
with an
gefunden habe.
example that I found on the German news
Wird
website
gemeldet
Focus Online.
vom britischen
The
Nachrichtenwesen
British
bezüglich
intelligence
des Einsatzes
service
der
has
russischen Luftwaffe.
reported in terms of the Russian
Russische
Air Force
Ausbildung bei der
that
Luftwaffe
Russian
habe sich
training in the Air
von
Force
mutmaßlich jahrelang
has
stärker
allegedly
konzentriert,
focused
hochrangige
for
Militärs
years
zu beeindrucken,
to impress
als
high-ranking
dynamische
officers
Einsatzszenarien verschiedener Truppen
and
zu trainieren.
to rather than
Ich sage dazu
training
mal eins,
certain
auch bei
scenarios
uns waren
for
viele
operations.
beeindruckt von dem, was die
And
gezeigt
many
haben.
were impressed with what they were shown.
Aber das hat Wirkung.
But this, of
Erstens,
course, had consequences.
Russland hat geglaubt, dass es viel
One,
stärker ist, als
Russia
es war.
thought that they were much stronger than they
Die waren
actually
auch
were.
geblendet,
They
zweitens.
were also blinded by
Und drittens war die Truppe schlichtweg schlecht
what they were
ausgebildet.
seeing, but also they were very poorly trained.
Besseres Beispiel für das Gesagte hätte ich nicht finden können.
And I think there's no better example for what I just
nochmal,
explained to
es
you
war
than this
hauptsächlich die
report.
schwache Führung,
So mainly it was
die
just
Desaster
weak
geführt hat,
leadership
wirklich
that
lesen,
led to
das
this
verstehen.
disaster
Besser.
that we've
Vielen
seen.
Dank für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit.
And let's hope that the Chinese know better. And thank you for your attention.
Herr Admiral, herzlichen Dank für die
Thank you very much
Ausführungen zur Frage der Führungskultur.
for your presentation regarding
Einen
leadership
wesentlichen
culture.
Aspekt
You have
dessen
talked
darstellen,
about
was
a
zwischen
substantial
Hardware
aspect
und
as
Software
to what
passieren muss,
happens
damit
at the
auch etwas
interface
als
or what should
System
happen
funktioniert.
between hardware and software so that a whole
ganz
system
kurz,
will work.
nun
And
den
very briefly,
verbleibende Zeit
I would
auch
like
für
to
Fragen
take this
freigeben.
opportunity
Und,
to
Herr General, bitte
give you
sehr.
the opportunity to ask any questions. General, please.
vorgetragen haben. Was ich nicht verstehe ist,
Thank you very much for
ich
this
habe ja
very
eine Division
interesting
übernommen nach der
presentation. I do
Wiedervereinigung,
not
die ja
understand
1:1
one
ein Abbild einer russischen Division war.
thing,
Und es waren auch
however.
noch Deutsche, die da waren. Und alle Schwächen,
there were
die Sie
Germans
aufgeführt
present
haben,
and all the
sind damals
weaknesses
aufgetreten.
actually
Ich hatte
you
keinen Bataillonskommandeur, der in der Lage
mentioned
war, eine einfache
were
Geländebesprechung
apparent
zu machen.
there.
Wir mussten total von Anfang
we
anfangen
lacked
und umschulen.
the
Und
total
was ich nicht
staff
verstehe, ist, dass in den letzten Jahren ja immer wieder
capabilities, so
rumgetönt wurde,
retraining
ja, die
had to
russischen
be
Streitkräfte sind
introduced. It was
modernisiert
said
worden.
that
Und was Sie auch
Russian
gesagt
armed
haben,
forces had
tolle
been
Panzer
modernized,
bei den
and
Paraden,
also
die
it was
vorbeifahren.
said that
Aber
the
Konsequenzen und
tanks
Erkenntnisse sind
that
offenbar daraus nicht
went through the
gezogen worden.
strait at the parades. But were there any learnings actually? Apologies on the part of the
dazu habe ich eine
translators. The
Meinung, eine
microphones did not work
nicht
properly. So
unbedingt belegen kann, aber ich
it's just a
vermute mal,
personal
viele
opinion
werden es
is the answer. I cannot prove
Wenn ich
this, but
wissen
many
will,
will
wie
agree
ein
with me.
Gegner,
If
ein
you want to
potenzieller
know
aussieht,
how
dann muss
a
ich da mal genau
potential or what a
hingucken, muss es
potential opponent
analysieren,
looks
zur
like, you
Freizeit
need
zur
to
Kenntnis zu
properly look, analyze
In den letzten
it,
Jahrzehnten
and
waren wir ja gar
be
nicht bereit,
willing
Russland als
to
Gegner zur Kenntnis zu nehmen.
accept the consequences.
Jetzt
In
erinnere mich
previous
an
years, we have not
den
really
Ausspruch
been
eines
willing to accept
Parteivorsitzenden
Russia
einer größeren
as
Partei in Deutschland, die
an
momentan
opponent.
die Bundeskanzler
One
stellt.
political party is in
sagt, ich
Germany,
verstehe es
the
nicht.
Social Democrats once said in
Jahrzehntelang
Germany.
haben wir
I do
fest
not
an der Seite
understand this
Russlands
because for many
Hat er gesagt.
years we
Ich
stood
habe auf Twitter gesagt, ich dachte, wir standen fest auf der Seite des Westens.
shoulder by shoulder with Russia.
Wenn man
And
aber so
I
denkt,
was flabbergasted.
dann ist man nicht in der
However,
Lage
if you
zu
think
erkennen,
like that and you're not in a
was sich da
position to
zusammenhängt.
understand what
Man
our
wollte nicht
clouds
lernen,
are
naja.
coming up on the horizon, so you're unwilling to listen and we are all footing the bill now.
Ja, mein Name ist Uwe Hartmann. Ich bin, wie man erkennen kann,
Uwe
Heeresmann
Hartmann.
und freue mich, so viel über maritime Aspekte gehört zu haben.
It's really been great to hear so much about naval aspects. Could you tell us a little bit about the Chinese initiative and what is the role played by the Scandinavian countries? Because we could tend to believe that China, for example, would be willing to focus on the land to Europe and avoid Americans at sea, but maybe Putin's strategic goals could be better understood if the cooperation between Russia and China would be seen against this backdrop.
It's a very interesting question.
Das ist eine sehr interessante Frage. Also ich werde versuchen, diese Frage zu beantworten. Es ist aber durchaus kein leichtes Unterfangen. Ich werde damit beginnen zu sagen, dass Schweden das erste Land war, das gewissermaßen mit China seinen Frieden geschlossen hat. Wir hatten jahrzehntelange Kooperation mit China, aber wir haben China nie vollumfänglich verstanden. Und ich bin der Ansicht, dass die maritimen Interessen Chinas nicht nur auf Heimatgebiet extrem groß sind. Ich möchte da ein Beispiel aus Schweden geben. Die Chinesen haben Häfen aufgekauft in den letzten Jahren. Und vor einigen Jahren war es so, dass da eine Zeitung darauf aufmerksam geworden ist. Und die Opposition in Schweden war sehr stark. Und jetzt hat man da Einhalt geboten. Und ich denke, die Expansion von China im maritimen Bereich in Europa, in der Arktik und in Richtung Vereinigte Staaten, nun, das könnte schon Putin das Image geben, dass er doch diesbezüglich federführend sein könnte, ihm das Ruder gewissermaßen zu überlassen. Das heißt, von meiner Perspektive ist es so, dass die Chinesen noch gefährlicher sind als die Russen. Ich weiß jetzt nicht, ob damit Ihre Frage beantwortet ist, aber ich kann da sehr gerne noch weitere Ausführungen treffen. However, I should like to add to this, Russians and Chinese, well, they pretend that they cooperate closely. However, they have conflicts of interest. Correct, and this is why things are not going as, you know, the average Chinese, or rather the Chinese Prime Minister and President would like to see this. I have an expert in Chinese studies working with me, and she has a short while ago published a book on the relations between Russia and China, and this would be a book that I could recommend, so a good read. And I think we tend to make things a little easier, and fortunately things are not that easy as we tend to see them. So my naval comrades, please correct me if I'm wrong. However, I would like to say the following. We should take into consideration that especially the northeastern passage is a big challenge to naval operations. Also during summertime, even though global warming seems to be getting a big problem, so ships have a hard time making a passage there. There is no proper infrastructure. Search and rescue operations are not available to the extent needed. So therefore, it is apparent that rather than Shanghai, the route is much shorter than having to go through the Suez Canal or across India, around India for that matter. And it would need a lot more global warming for that matter, so that the sea route could be used in a manner so that really bulk carriers, big container ships, etc., could pass this passage also at acceptable insurance provisions for that matter, at a regular level, at 365 days a year, without hitting or having to do search and rescue operations, icebreakers, etc. So therefore we need to be a bit cautious. Navigational systems are not available. GPS does not work appropriately, at least not as needed, the closer you get to Arctic. So that is a big challenge for naval operations and for ships.
Wie nachhaltig sind die geschilderten Schwächen vom russischen Militär
the sustainability of the weaknesses of Russian military, the armed forces and the navy, and what can we learn from this and how fast can we learn from this? So from the first day of the Ukraine war, the example from Finland was quite interesting, because from the Finnish perspective, Russian army did not look very good, as it were, even though Finland did not get any arms supplies. And when Germany, Russia, etc. attacked, then Finland recovered quite quickly. And then, you know, Germans did not have any, have any chance, you know, in terms of winning the war. So is that something we are going to see? And can Russia, you know, learn from what has happened? I'm going to come back to this later on. I have tried to allude to the question, but I do not think that this is the case, at least not substantially. What Ukrainians have learned since 2014 has been an option, because they said goodbye to the radical, let us say, authoritarian leadership. So they have copied US leadership structures. And things are going to take a while. I can tell you a story from 1971 where a Russian pilot, an Air Force pilot with a MiG, basically made his escape to Japan. So he was literally passed on to Americans, and they were a bit worried. And this young man, as it were, this young pilot was then transported to an American carrier, and he then underwent training, as it were. So he had a look around, and he then said, well, you know, there's one thing I do not understand. All those people, you know, running around here, who's telling them what to do? And he was then asked, how does the Russian Navy basically take time to respond? And he said nobody, actually, because they were trained to do things. And he then said, you know, then your question can be answered quite easily, because Russians will never do a good job of that. So having said that, during World War II, you know, a lot of Russian success was facilitated by a lot of US support. So a lot of Russian generals were overestimated. So this is why I'm very optimistic in that regard. I'm very optimistic in that the Russians, I do believe that the Russians will not make a good job of that.
Admiral, could I just add to that?
Ich möchte da gern ergänzend eine Anmerkung machen. Nun, ich hatte die Gelegenheit, die Ukraine im Jahr 2002, als ich der Flottenkommandant war, zu besuchen, und das war eine Landeübung. Und im Jahr 2002 war es so, dass die Kommandostruktur russisch war, also nach dem russischen Beispiel. Das heißt, die Soldaten waren überhaupt nicht motiviert, man hat nichts ohne direkten Befehl getan. Aber seit 2009, 2010 hat sich die Situation verändert. Und speziell seit 2014 Kanada, Schweden und viele andere Länder gingen in die Ukraine und haben sie nach westlichem Vorbild ausgebildet in der Kriegsführung. Und ich denke, dass Russland wirklich die Ukraine unterschätzt hat, was seit 2014 in der Ukraine passiert wird. Und ich möchte Ihre Frage noch erweitert beantworten. Sie haben nach der Nachhaltigkeit dieser Entscheidung gefragt. Ich denke, dass die russische Ausstattung, vor allem die der schweren Kriegsgeräte, also Tanker und so weiter, als gut gegolten haben. Wenn aber beispielsweise der Zuständige jetzt nicht das Öl wechselt, sondern es hingegen auf dem schwarzen Markt verkauft, dann wird der Panzer stehen bleiben. Und genau das haben wir in der Ukraine beobachten können. Das wäre es auch schon von meiner Seite. Dankeschön.
Ich hätte noch eine
eher kurzfristige Betrachtung mit der
A
Lage
brief observation I would like to
des
share
Schwarzen
with you
Meeres,
regarding the Black Sea and the weaknesses of the Russian Navy, things that are being observed. There are certain limitations, and of course that depends a lot on the extent as to what manner a threat can be perceived really from land. We have seen in the Azov Sea, where over many kilometers really at land, that is regarded as occupied territory. So in that regard, it's really difficult to act from occupied territory. And this is something that has shifted towards the West. And having said this, it very much depends on what Ukrainians really are able to do at sea in order to be able to, let us say, offset those weaknesses. And when that situation becomes more and more difficult, most probably then the weakness will not be that pronounced. So that is not something systemic really, but that is an operational observation for the months and years to come, if you will. Another question regarding the corn, the grain for that matter, that now we cannot get out of Ukraine because there are so many mines in the harbors. How can that situation, that problem be solved and overcome? All right then, that is a huge problem for that matter. It is also the question of the mines, as you have said, but you know, a passage could be facilitated. That's a bit of a tactical challenge, but that could be overcome. The problem as such has to do with the fact that Russians will not allow, let us say, a small trade fleet, for example, going to Odessa. And in the first weeks of the war, the trade ships were literally sunk by Russians. That is something that has happened, and insurance premiums have skyrocketed, and therefore many are unwilling to do that. So in the first place, Russia has to allow for such shipments. Now, we could say, all right, now on Western territory, or in its Western territory, due to the sea denial, as I've explained it, Ukrainians could make sure that Western powers get in, but that does not automatically mean that operations can be launched. So in that regard, we're going to have to talk about sea control, which is to say Russians cannot get in, but also they cannot influence that. That includes submarines or airborne missiles, you name it. That is a wide area, field that you need to cover, and you can just do that by military operations. And that brings us immediately to a situation where things can get quite delicate soon, because who is going to do that in the first place? And that would just be an option that would mean conflict. Let's take a step back. Theoretically, from the Russian side, you know, permission should be given in the first place. That is key to success, if you will. A couple of modalities, you know, minor arrangements can be agreed on, but from my point of view, you need to get Russia's permission. So, next question. This is an excellent example, really, of information campaigns and the let us say, presentation of who is the victim and who's the perpetrator, because Russia's narrative is that it is the West's fault that corn grain cannot be supplied. That is an extraordinary distortion of reality. A question to you, sir. Wie schaut es mit der Zukunft der Amphibien aus, mit dieser Landung in Odessa so weiter? Das hat sich ja nicht materialisiert, so wie wir das gesehen haben. Sie waren ja hier ein zuständiger Offizier. Wie schauen wir jetzt aus? Das heißt, werden wir jetzt eine Diskussion haben, oder wie wird die Diskussion sein mit den amphibiengestützten Kräften? Werden wir wirklich wiederum einen Schritt zurück tätigen? Nun, also diese amphibiengestützten Kräfte oder die Marinekräfte, da ist die Zukunft von meiner Seite her nicht wirklich klar. Das heißt, die ukrainischen Marinekräfte Streitkräfte. Nun, die waren, soweit ich jetzt weiß, bis vor kurzem sehr klein. Das heißt, ich weiß eigentlich nicht, ob sie eine wichtige Rolle in diesem Krieg spielen können. Ich weiß nicht, ob Sie vielleicht da etwas ergänzend möchten. Die Frage geht an den Kollegen. Well, I would say that expecting that the option of a landing of forces from Russia's perspective is an option, and as long as they cannot really afford that, simply because the threat is too high, the threat of such a landing, then it is unlikely. But should the perspective change, then this is certainly an option, if you will, that is a fact. There are plans, and if there are chances that such a plan can be implemented, then maybe it could be done. So I would not say it's off the table. You know, for the time being, for the way things are in the Western Black Sea area, that is a fact. Ich stimme völlig mit Ihnen überein, und ich möchte noch ergänzen, von russischer Seite, man zögert hier extrem etwas zu tun. Nun, warum? Ich habe ja schon erklärt, dass die Russen zweimal überlegen müssen oder sollten, bevor sie wieder etwas Ähnliches tun. I should like to add to this. Russia simply cannot afford to lose out on amphibious forces. They need that for transportations to the Sea of Azov, etc. Now, in that regard, of course, it is quite risky. And right now, I do not see any option that somebody is going to try something like that. But what would happen, if I understand you correctly? Would it be premature to say that on the basis of the fact that Russian forces, for example, due to Ukrainian defense, have not been able to carry out an amphibious operation to support the land-based initiative, and that subsequently for sea warfare, it would mean that a rethinking in this strategy would place. Microphone, please. The interpreters cannot understand the question. If today you talk about a landing in the style of what happened in Normandy, something like that would happen if it were about like minor operations. Of course, they landed in Libya, etc. That would be interesting options. If you have an enemy that is not able to defend himself properly, then of course amphibians, but apart from that. Conclusion, please.
Also, wer den Joint Planning Process für amphibische Operationen
in the joint planning process for amphibian process, and you studied that in the US, and everybody who has done so will know that the amphibian element is just a minor element. Whether a bridgehead or a beachhead should be established. But what do you need then? You need infantry, and the Marine Corps in the US was able to do that, and I'm talking about the invasion, of course, so they had proper trained infantry, and then you need foot infantry. Do you have enough sources? And that is, of course, highly problematic, and I'm sure you're going to confirm that on the basis of your studies made in the US.
Yes,
of course, that is applicable what you're saying. So to come back to Russia, then of course the big amphibian-based operations, where many infanterists are brought on a land, and then an occupation is lodged, is something that we have not seen. It's just supporting really the Navy flank, as it were. We saw that in Georgia in 2008, and also now in Ukraine. So this is an additional component, an additional flank that you're opening up. That is really the way we see this. So these large-scale operations are not provided for in the first place. I would like to add to this. The Western amphibian powers, of course, have other options. Let me name one. The objective maneuver. Now, without this stop at the beach, which is to say no landing ships, no landing boats actually go on land, but directly from a ship you enter the target, for example, with helicopters or with other tools, for example. And a lot can be done. But at the end of the day, this is a question of availability, and of course these are limited operations. Now, Americans and at a certain time, the UK, for example, they were able or have been able to do a lot. All right, then, now, ladies and gentlemen, dear Wolfgang, I do believe that we have made excellent use of our time resources. This is a good ending, really, of our panel. Now we're going to break for coffee. Now, I would like to thank you all very much for closely listening to us. Thank you very much to the three gentlemen, and thank you very much for the excellent presentation. This is the end of our panel. Thank you very much.